thought I was emotionally unavailable. Turns out I was just being rejected. I'm Daniel Harris, 31M. I've always thought of myself as steady, reliable. Maybe a little boring in the way people mean when they say, good guy. I'm not loud, not dramatic. I show up, I listen. And for a long time, I believed that if something was failing in my relationship, it had to be because I wasn't enough in some way I couldn't quite identify. When I met Claire, everything felt easy in a way I hadn't experienced before. We were both in our mid-20s, working decent jobs, still figuring life out. We met through mutual friends at a housewarming party. I remember she laughed at one of my stupid jokes about the host's aggressively modern couch and said, "Okay, you're funny." I didn't expect that. Felt like a small win, but it stuck with me. The early months were warm. That's the word I keep coming back to. Warm. We talked about everything. Childhood stories, half-formed dreams, things we were afraid to admit to other people. We stayed up late just lying on the floor of her apartment, music playing quietly, talking about nothing important and everything important at the same time. She used to reach for my hand automatically, like it was second nature. I didn't have to think about how to be a partner. I just was one. We moved in together after about a year. It wasn't some big dramatic decision. It felt logical, natural. My lease was ending, her place was bigger, closer to both our jobs. The first year living together was honestly great. Not perfect, but real. We argued sometimes, sure, but it never felt like us versus each other. It felt like us versus the problem. Looking back now, I can see the first cracks forming, but at the time they were so small I didn't even register them as cracks. Just changes. She stopped reaching for my hand first. She stopped asking follow-up questions when I talked about my day. Sex slowed down a bit, which I chalked up to stress. Work had gotten heavier for both of us. That happens, right? At first, it was little excuses. She was tired. She had a headache. She wasn't feeling great about her body that week. All of that seemed normal, reasonable. I never pushed. I didn't want to be that guy. What I didn't realize was that the excuses never stopped. They just evolved. Affection outside the bedroom started disappearing too. Hugs became brief, one-arm things. Kisses turned into quick pecks, often aimed vaguely in the direction of my cheek while she was already turning away. If I tried to cuddle on the couch, she'd stiffen just slightly, like she was tolerating it rather than enjoying it. That stiffness did something to my head. I started hesitating before touching her at all. I'd catch myself mid-motion, hand hovering in the air, wondering if I was about to annoy her. Eventually, I just stopped reaching out. It hurt less to reject myself than to be rejected again. The house got quieter. Not loud silence, but that weird kind where there's always some background noise. TV, phone videos, podcasts, but no real connection. We'd sit on opposite ends of the couch, both staring at different screens. I'd glance over at her sometimes, wanting to say something, but I never knew what to say anymore. Conversations became transactional. Did you pay the electric bill? What do you want for dinner? Can you pick up milk on your way home? If I tried to talk about something deeper, something I was excited about or worried about, she'd nod, maybe say without ever looking up from her phone. After a while, I stopped bringing things up. I told myself this was just adulthood, that this was what long-term relationships turned into once the honeymoon phase ended. Everyone jokes about it, right? Comfort over passion, stability over sparks. But something about it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like absence. Around this time, Claire started spending more time with a new group of friends she met through a fitness class. I didn't think much of it at first. I was glad she had people. I wasn't the jealous type, but I started noticing how her language changed after nights out with them. She began using phrases I'd never heard her use before. Stuff like emotional labor and holding space. At first I tried to keep up, Googling terms so I wouldn't sound ignorant. I wanted to understand her world. One night, I forgot to replace the empty paper towel roll. I'd meant to grab a new one from the pantry but got distracted by a work email. Claire came into the kitchen, saw the empty roll, and sighed loudly. "I just wish you'd take initiative," she said. I apologized immediately and replaced it. She shook her head and said, "It's not about the paper towels. It's about the mental load." I remember standing there, confused, wondering how I'd missed something so important. I asked her to explain what she meant. She told me, calmly, patiently, that she felt like she had to manage everything in the house, that even when I helped, she still had to think about it, remind me, plan around my forgetfulness. I felt awful. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I promised to do better. That became my default response. I'll do better. I started anticipating chores before she asked. I made lists. I set reminders on my phone. I cleaned things that didn't even need cleaning yet, just in case. I thought if I removed stress from her life, maybe she'd feel closer to me again. But the closeness never came back. Instead, the goalposts moved. If I cleaned the kitchen, she pointed out I'd missed a spot. If I planned a date, she said it felt forced. If I asked her how she was feeling, she said I was interrogating her. If I didn't ask, she said I wasn't emotionally present. I was constantly wrong, no matter what I did. And slowly, without realizing it, I started to believe the narrative she was building, that I was emotionally deficient, that I lacked something fundamental other people just naturally had, that I needed fixing. I read articles. I watched videos. I took online quizzes about attachment styles. I convinced myself I was avoidant, emotionally unavailable, bad at intimacy. Every piece of advice I found told me the same thing. Try harder, listen more, be better. So I did. And the more I tried, the further away she felt. By the time I noticed how unhappy I was already convinced it was my fault. Once the idea settled in my head that I was the problem, everything else followed naturally. If something was wrong, then it was my responsibility to fix it. That felt fair. That felt adult. I didn't tell anyone how bad things felt. Not friends, not family. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be the guy complaining about his relationship when there wasn't some obvious villain. Claire wasn't yelling at me. She wasn't cheating. She wasn't cruel in any way that would be easy to explain. She was just distant. And distance is hard to point to without sounding needy. So instead of talking about it, I worked on myself. I bought books about emotional intelligence. I read articles about being a better partner. I watched YouTube videos where calm men with perfect lighting explained how to show up emotionally for your spouse. I took notes. Actual notes. I felt ridiculous doing it, but also hopeful. Like if I could just learn the right skills, things would click back into place. I started paying attention to everything. Her tone when she spoke to me, her body language, the timing of her moods. I tried to predict what she needed before she had to ask. I thought that was what being emotionally attuned meant. If she seemed quiet, I'd ask, "Do you want to talk about anything?" Sometimes she'd sigh and say, "I don't have the energy right now." So I'd back off, telling myself I was respecting her boundaries. Other times she'd say, "I don't know why you're asking. You should just know." That one hurt more than I admitted. How was I supposed to know if she wouldn't tell me? Still, I apologized. I always apologized. Cooked more, cleaned more, planned more, complimented her more. I made sure to validate her feelings whenever she expressed frustration, even when I didn't fully understand what I'd done wrong. If she said, "I feel like you don't really see me," I'd respond with something like, "I'm sorry you feel unseen. I want to understand how I can do better." She'd nod, sometimes thank me for being receptive. But the warmth never came back. The physical closeness never followed. Sex had basically vanished by this point. Months would go by without anything more than a quick kiss. If I brought it up gently, she'd frame it as pressure. "I don't want intimacy to feel like an obligation," she'd say. So I stopped bringing it up. I told myself that wanting intimacy was selfish, that real love meant patience, that if I just kept showing up, eventually she'd feel safe enough to reconnect. But the safety she talked about always seemed to be something just out of reach. Around this time, she suggested we start checking in weekly. First, I thought this was a good sign. Structure sounded helpful. Maybe this would give us space to actually talk. The first check-in was awkward but calm. We sat at the dining table. She asked how I felt about our relationship. I told her honestly that I missed feeling close to her, that I felt like we were drifting. She nodded and said, "I appreciate you sharing that. For me, I just need you to be more emotionally present." I asked what that looked like to her. She paused, then said, "It's hard to explain. It's more of an energy thing." That answer didn't help, but I didn't push. I didn't want to invalidate her feelings. Over the next few weeks, the check-ins became less about us and more about me. She'd tell me she felt drained, that she felt like she was carrying the relationship, that she needed me to step up emotionally. Whenever I asked for specifics, she'd say things like, "I don't want to have to spell it out. That defeats the point." So I stopped asking. I started monitoring myself constantly. Before speaking, I'd ask myself, is this emotionally intelligent? Is this supportive? Is this going to make things worse? It was exhausting. I remember one night in particular. We were sitting on the couch watching something I didn't really care about. She seemed tense. I asked if everything was okay. She said, "You always ask that." I apologized and said I just wanted to make sure she felt supported. She replied, "It feels like you're doing it because you think you're supposed to, not because you actually care." That sentence lodged itself deep in my chest. Cared. God, I cared. But now even my caring was being framed as performative. Later that same night, I didn't ask anything. I just sat quietly. She eventually turned to me and said, "You've been really withdrawn tonight." I didn't know what to say. I was either too much or not enough. There was no middle ground where I could just exist. The worst part was how reasonable everything sounded on the surface. If I tried to explain this to someone else, it would come out messy and vague. She says I'm not emotionally present. That sounds like a legitimate complaint. That sounds like something I should work on. So I worked on it harder. I started initiating deeper conversations, asking about her childhood, her fears, her goals. Sometimes she'd engage, but it felt forced, like she was tolerating the conversation rather than enjoying it. When I talked about my own fears, about feeling lonely, about worrying that I was failing her, she'd get quiet. "I don't have the capacity to hold that right now," she'd say. So I stopped sharing those things. Little by little, I disappeared from my own relationship. I became careful, polished, self-monitoring, always trying to say the right thing, always afraid of saying the wrong one. And every night, lying next to her in bed, staring at the ceiling while she scrolled on her phone, I wondered what was wrong with me that I couldn't make my own wife want me. By the end of that phase, I genuinely believed I was emotionally broken. I just hadn't realized yet that broken wasn't the right word. By the time I realized something was deeply wrong, the narrative had already solidified. It wasn't just that Claire felt disconnected anymore. It was that I was now the explanation for everything that felt off in her life. The distance, the lack of desire, the frustration, all of it traced back to me and my supposed emotional deficiencies. She didn't say it cruelly. That was the part that messed with my head the most. She said it calmly, rationally, like a therapist delivering a diagnosis. "You're not a bad person," she told me one night during one of our check-ins. "You just have some emotional blind spots." I asked her what she meant. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. "You struggle with emotional availability. You intellectualize instead of feeling. It makes it hard for me to feel safe." That word again. Safe. I didn't argue. I nodded. I asked what I could do to improve. She said, "You need to sit with discomfort instead of trying to fix it. And you need to stop centering your feelings when I'm expressing mine." So I tried to do that. If she complained about feeling unsupported, I didn't explain myself anymore. I didn't point out all the things I was doing. I just said, "I hear you." If she snapped at me for something small, I told myself she was reacting from a place of unmet needs. If I felt hurt, I swallowed it. My feelings were now obstacles. Hers were truths. The bedroom situation didn't improve. If anything, it got worse. Intimacy wasn't just rare anymore. It was something she talked about like a future possibility contingent on my growth. "I can't feel desire when I don't feel emotionally connected," she said once, as if explaining a simple equation. I asked her if she felt emotionally connected at all. She hesitated, then said, "Not consistently." That answer should have devastated me. Instead, I took it as feedback. I asked what consistency looked like. She said, "It's hard to describe. You'll know when you're there." So I chased something undefined. Anytime I tried to initiate physical affection, resting my hand on her knee, pulling her close in bed, she'd stiffen or gently move away. "This feels premature," she'd say. Premature. As if intimacy was a reward waiting at the end of a long, invisible process. I started associating my own desire with shame. Wanting her became proof that I wasn't evolved enough yet, that I was still operating from some base, needy place. One night, after I'd cooked dinner, cleaned up, and asked her how she was feeling, she sighed and said, "I just wish you'd show up without me having to guide you." That sentence echoed in my head for days. I asked her what showing up meant. She looked at me like the answer was obvious. "It's emotional leadership." I didn't know what that meant, but I nodded anyway. I Googled it later. What I found was vague motivational content about being grounded, present, assertive without being controlling. None of it explained how to lead emotionally in a relationship where every move felt wrong. At some point, I noticed that nothing I did ever led to positive reinforcement. There was no "this helped" or "I appreciate that." There was only neutral acknowledgement at best, criticism at worst. If I planned a date, she said it felt performative. If I asked her what she wanted, she said I should already know. If I made a decision on my own, she said I wasn't considering her emotional reality. It was like playing a game where the rules changed every time I made progress. And the language she used made it impossible to challenge her without sounding defensive. If I said, "That hurts," she'd respond with, "I'm not responsible for your feelings." If I said, "I feel blamed for everything," she'd say, "That's your perception." If I tried to explain my intentions, she'd say, "Impact matters more than intent." Every conversation ended the same way. Me apologizing, promising to reflect, promising to do better. I stopped recognizing myself. I used to be confident, opinionated, comfortable making decisions. Now I second-guessed every word before it left my mouth. I walked on eggshells in my own home, and the cruelest part was that I still loved her. I still wanted her approval. I still believed that if I could just reach whatever standard she had in her head, she'd soften again. But that softness never came. One night, after another conversation where she explained why she couldn't be intimate with me yet, I asked her quietly, "Do you still want to be with me?" She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I want to see if you're capable of growth." That was the moment something shifted deep inside me. Not shattered, not exploded, just shifted. Because love shouldn't feel like a probation period. And I was starting to realize that the person who felt unsafe in this relationship wasn't her. It was me. The thing that finally broke the spell wasn't a fight. It wasn't a betrayal. It wasn't even something she said. It was something small, almost stupid. It was a Wednesday night. I remember because I'd stayed late at work fixing a problem that wasn't technically mine. When I got home, Claire was already in bed. The lights were off, her phone glowing in the dark. I hesitated at the doorway, the way I always did now, bracing myself for the possibility that my presence alone might be irritating. I slid into bed carefully, leaving space between us. After a minute, I reached over and rested my hand on her arm. Not in a sexual way, just contact, reassurance, a reminder that we were still married. She immediately tensed. Not dramatically, just enough that I felt it. "Daniel," she said quietly, not unkindly, "can you not right now?" I pulled my hand back instantly. "Sorry," she sighed. Not angry, not annoyed, just tired. "I'm really trying to unwind. Today was a lot." "I get it," I said, and I meant it. She turned back to her phone. I stared at the ceiling. Something about that moment felt different from all the others. Usually, after moments like that, I'd spiral internally. I'd replay the interaction, ask myself what I'd done wrong, tell myself to try harder tomorrow. But this time, I didn't feel guilty. I felt empty. And in that emptiness, a thought surfaced that I hadn't let myself think before. What if this isn't something I can fix? The question scared me. I pushed it away at first, but it came back the next day. And the day after that, I started paying attention not to how I could improve, but to the pattern itself. I noticed how affection was always framed as something she couldn't give, never something she wanted to give. I noticed how intimacy was always postponed into a vague future once I'd done enough work. I noticed how there was never a finish line. No moment where she said, "This helped. I feel closer to you." And then I noticed something else. She wasn't trying either. She didn't ask about my day unless I prompted her. She didn't initiate touch. Ever. She didn't plan dates, check in emotionally, or make space for my feelings. Everything flowed one way. One night, during another check-in, she told me she felt emotionally drained by the relationship itself. I asked, very calmly, "What are you doing to make it better?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" I said slowly. "What are you actively doing to rebuild connection between us?" She looked genuinely confused. "I've been very clear about what I need from you." That was her answer. Not us, not we, just me. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a partnership anymore. This was a performance review. I was being evaluated constantly, graded on criteria I didn't define, chasing approval from someone who held all the power and none of the responsibility. Affection wasn't being withheld because I was failing. It was being withheld to keep me trying. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I remembered how warm she used to be, how easily she'd touch me before, how naturally she'd laugh and lean into me. That warmth hadn't disappeared because I changed. It disappeared because she did. And instead of owning that, she'd made me the problem. The next check-in felt surreal. She talked about how she still didn't feel emotionally safe, how she needed more consistency, how she needed me to lead. And for the first time, I didn't apologize. I just listened. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly. I said, "Okay, just that." She frowned. "That's it." "I hear you," I said. "I'll reflect." She seemed unsatisfied, but she let it go. Inside, something had gone very still. I stopped trying to convince her of my worth. I stopped chasing clarity. I stopped begging silently for scraps of affection. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I didn't even change my tone. I just stepped back. And that's when things really started to change. Because when you stop begging for love, the person withholding it notices immediately. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no speech. I just stopped chasing. I didn't stop being polite. I didn't become cold or cruel. I still cooked dinner, still cleaned up, still paid bills, still said good morning and good night. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But internally, something fundamental had changed. I no longer oriented my entire emotional life around her approval. When she came home quiet, I didn't rush to decode it. When she sighed, I didn't assume it was my fault. When she withdrew, I didn't follow. I gave her space, not as a strategy, but because I finally understood that proximity without mutual desire is just another form of loneliness. The first sign she noticed was how calm I became. She'd complain about work, expecting validation, and I'd listen without overcompensating. I'd say, "That sounds frustrating." And then, "Stop. No fixing. No bending myself into knots to prove I cared." She'd look at me, waiting for more. It never came. I stopped initiating deep conversations. Not out of spite, but because I was exhausted from carrying them alone. I didn't ask how she felt about us anymore. I didn't check in. I didn't bring up intimacy. And that's when the anxiety started. At first, it was subtle. She'd linger in doorways. She'd ask what I was thinking. "Nothing in particular," I'd say honestly. That answer used to frustrate her when I was over-talking. Now it unsettled her. She started sitting closer to me on the couch. Not touching, just closer. I noticed it without reacting. She tried making small talk, asking about my day the way she used to months ago. I answered, kindly, briefly. The imbalance she'd been comfortable with was gone. One night, she rested her head on my shoulder while we were watching TV. It was the first time she'd initiated contact in months. My body reacted out of habit. My muscles tensed, my heart jumped, but I didn't move. I let her rest there for a moment. Then I gently stood up. "I'm going to bed," I said. She looked confused. "Already?" "Yeah, I'm tired." That was it. No explanation. No apology. She watched me walk down the hallway like she was trying to understand a puzzle that no longer made sense. Over the next week, she tried harder. She laughed at my jokes again. She asked if I wanted to go for walks. She touched my arm when she spoke. But it felt off. Not bad, just late. Because now I could see it clearly. Her affection returned the moment it was no longer guaranteed. And that realization hurt more than the rejection ever did. One evening, she confronted me. "You've been really distant lately," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. I nodded. "I guess so." "That's not okay," she said. "It feels like you're withdrawing." I almost laughed. For over a year, I had felt like a ghost in my own home, and now she was uncomfortable. I'm just giving you space, I said calmly. You said you needed it. That's not what I meant, she replied quickly. I meant emotional space. Not this. This what? This detachment. I thought about all the nights I lay awake next to her, feeling unwanted. All the times she'd pulled away from my touch. All the conversations where my feelings were labeled burdensome. This is what it feels like, I said quietly. When you stop performing. Her face changed then. Not anger, fear. She started crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears slipping down her face as she said, I feel like I'm losing you. That sentence landed differently than she probably intended. Because for the first time, she wasn't talking about how she felt unsafe, or drained, or disappointed. She was talking about loss. I looked at her and felt sad, but not desperate. I've been here the whole time, I said. You just didn't want me. She shook her head. That's not true. It is, I said gently. You wanted a version of me that earned your affection. Not me. She tried to argue. She said she was just asking for effort. That she needed consistency. That she needed growth. I didn't fight her on it. I did grow, I said. Just not in the way you expected. She reached for my hand. I let her touch it, but I didn't squeeze back. I don't think I can do this anymore, she whispered. Neither could I, but I didn't say it yet. I needed her to understand what had actually happened. Not through blame, but through clarity. The conversation happened on a Sunday morning. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No one stormed out. That somehow made it worse. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Sunlight was coming in through the blinds, cutting the room into soft stripes of gold and shadow. I remember noticing how ordinary everything looked. Like this could have been any other morning from the last 5 years. Claire had her coffee wrapped in both hands. She looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just worn down. I've been thinking a lot, she said. I nodded. Me too. She took a breath. I don't like how things feel between us right now. I didn't respond immediately. I waited. I'd learned that silence made people say what they really meant. It feels like you're checked out, she continued. Like you've given up. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. I didn't give up, I said quietly. I stopped auditioning. She frowned. That's not fair. It's accurate, I replied. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. I was just asking you to grow. I nodded slowly. And I did. I learned something important. What? That love isn't something you dangle in front of someone until they behave correctly. Her jaw tightened. That's not what I was doing. Then tell me this, I said, still calm. At any point over the last year, did you ask yourself what you could do to make me feel loved? She hesitated. That pause told me everything. I needed you to step up, she said eventually. I was exhausted. I know, I said. You told me, repeatedly. And you weren't meeting me where I was. Because you kept moving where there was, I replied. Every time I adjusted, the standard changed. She shook her head. You're twisting this. No, I said. I'm finally seeing it clearly. She leaned forward. So, what? You're saying this is all my fault? I didn't take the bait. I'm saying this stopped being a partnership, I said. At some point, you stopped seeing me as someone you wanted to be close to, and started seeing me as someone you needed to fix. Her eyes filled with tears. I never meant to hurt you. I believe that, I said. But intent doesn't erase impact. You taught me that, remember? She flinched. You withheld affection to motivate me, I continued. You framed intimacy as something I had to earn. You made my feelings into obstacles. And when I finally stopped chasing, you panicked. That's not, she started. Let me finish, I said gently but firmly. She went quiet. For months, I blamed myself. I thought I was broken. I thought I was emotionally defective. I spent nights lying next to you wondering what was wrong with me that my own wife didn't want me. Her breathing hitched. And then I realized something. I said. I wasn't emotionally unavailable. I was being rejected. Consistently. Systematically. Tears slid down her face now. I was trying to protect myself. So was I said. The difference is you did it by taking power. I did it by disappearing. She wiped her face. So what are you saying? I took a deep breath. I'm saying I don't feel safe with you anymore, I said. Her head snapped up. You don't get to use that word against me. I'm not using it against you, I replied. I'm using it honestly. I don't feel emotionally safe in a relationship where love is conditional and affection is a bargaining chip. She was silent for a long time. Finally, she whispered, I can change. That was the moment I knew it was over. Because a year ago, I would have clung to that sentence like a lifeline. Now it just made me tired. I don't doubt that you could, I said. But I don't want to wait and see anymore. Her face crumpled. So that's it. I nodded. Yes. You're just done. I finished a long time ago, I said softly. I just didn't know it yet. She cried then, fully, deep, shaking sobs. I didn't interrupt. I didn't comfort her. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that comforting her at my own expense was part of the cycle. When she calmed down, she asked, "Do you hate me?" "No," I said honestly. "But I don't trust you with my heart anymore." That was the truth. And truth has weight. We talked logistics after that. Calmly. Who would move out. How we'd handle finances. What we'd tell friends. Felt surreal. Like negotiating the end of something that had already died. That night, I packed a bag. She watched me from the doorway. "I never wanted this," she said. "I know," I replied. "But you built it anyway." I walked out without slamming the door. No fireworks. No screaming. Just the quiet end of a relationship that had been dying slowly for a very long time. And for the first time in over a year, the silence I stepped into didn't feel heavy. Felt honest. It took a few weeks for the quiet to stop feeling unfamiliar. At first, the silence in my new apartment felt too loud. There was no one sighing behind me. No phone glow in the dark. No unspoken tension hanging in the air. Just me, a mattress on the floor, a half-unpacked box of books, and the hum of the refrigerator. I slept badly at first. Old habits die hard. I'd wake up thinking I'd done something wrong, that I'd forgotten an obligation, that there was some emotional debt I hadn't paid. Then I'd remember. There was no list anymore. No standard to meet. No affection to earn. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my body started to relax. I noticed it one morning while making coffee. I caught myself humming. Stopped me cold. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that without realizing it. It felt like discovering a muscle I hadn't used in years. People asked how I was doing. I gave the honest answer. Better than I expected. Some nodded like they understood. Some didn't. A few tried to frame it as a loss, like I'd failed at something important. But I didn't feel like a failure anymore. I felt like someone who had survived a long drought and finally found water. I went back through old messages and journals, not to punish myself, but to understand. I saw how often I'd minimized my own needs, how often I'd apologized for wanting closeness, how easily I'd accepted the idea that love was something I had to deserve. I used to think strength meant endurance, staying, trying harder, proving you were worthy. Now I know strength can also look like leaving quietly when staying costs you your sense of self. Therapy helped not to fix me but to undo what I'd learned. To unlearn the idea that conflict meant failure. That desire was a flaw. That wanting to be wanted made me weak. Didn't. It made me human. I still think about Claire sometimes. Not with anger. Mostly with sadness. I don't doubt she believed she was doing the right thing. I don't doubt she was trying to protect herself in the only way she knew how. But understanding someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself to accommodate their wounds. You can have compassion without surrendering your dignity. The biggest lesson wasn't about her, though. It was about me. I learned that love without warmth is just obligation. That communication without empathy is control. That a relationship where only one person is allowed to need will eventually collapse under its own weight. And most importantly, I learned this. I wasn't emotionally unavailable. I was emotionally unwanted. Once I stopped confusing those two things, everything changed. I don't know what comes next. Maybe another relationship someday. Maybe a long stretch of being on my own. Either way, I'm no longer afraid of silence. Because this silence doesn't ask me to be smaller. It lets me breathe.
Thank you everyone for taking your time to listen to my stories that are posted in this channel. Your engagement and entertainment are a huge part of my motivation, and I hope you all will continue on supporting me in the future. Once again, thank you for watching my videos. For more content like this, please consider subscribing to my channel.